So a number of people, including some in the new Trump administration, believe that or argue that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is a high likelihood, that this is a very real, salient, imminent risk. Can you explain why you think they might be overrating that likelihood?
Yeah, it's a great question, Aaron. And indeed, I should probably start off by saying I think the people within the administration are actually divided on this question. There are some, including, I believe, the president himself, that don't think it's that likely, or they believe that they can talk to Xi and explain to him why it's not a smart thing to do. There are others, the new Undersecretary of Defense, Bridge Colby, who believe that it is likely and have been arguing that for some time now. And the old Defense Department, you might call it, the Biden Defense Department, did actually say that by 2027 or 2028, the administration, or let's call it the administration of Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party, would indeed be ready for an invasion. It's not ready now, but in 3 or 4 years, it could be or would be. Now, that's not saying that they would. That's just saying that the readiness might be there because their naval buildup is still going strong. So there are reasons. Let me start by saying there are reasons to believe that China might decide to attack Taiwan. I think the first most obvious reason is simple national pride. They believe Taiwan is an integral part of the larger greater China. They felt that they have overcome the century of humiliation, which really goes back to the Opium Wars of the 1840s. And they believe that it's now time to reabsorb Taiwan into this greater state. So national pride is on the line. And almost everyone agrees that the Chinese, if it were low cost, would want to absorb Taiwan in one way or another. Hopefully politically, but obviously militarily is the worry. The other aspect of this is some kind of belief, economically or otherwise, that they need Taiwan as part of their larger Belt Road Initiative, their larger expansion of their global economic sphere, and indeed, partly perhaps to control Southeast Asia in an economic or regionally, militarily dominant way. Bridge Colby, for example, has argued that, and he and we've been good friends since for about 10 years now. And he and I have disagreed on this. I helped him edit his book in a way, not edit, but to give comments to his book. We've disagreed on this for a long time, and we still disagree. Probably, I haven't chatted with him lately. But the thing that I would argue is that in the net sense, as they say in the business world, the net sense, when you take all the factors into account, Xi Jinping is a rational actor, and he's very aware of the trade-offs that would be entailed if he went into Taiwan militarily. What are the trade-offs? Well, I would say there are 3 aspects of this, all that reinforce or enhance our ability to deter Xi Jinping from doing this. One would be the direct costs, the costs that come from trying to cross about 100 miles of open sea, very rough sea, in fact, in the face of counterattacks or strikes from the Taiwanese, who control some islands in between China and the island itself. It's the other aspect of direct costs is landing troops on quite a rocky shore or even on beaches that have a very low level of water, which means that the landing craft would have to sort of land way out, like 100 yards or 75 yards out to the ocean. This is not like D-Day, June 1944. So that makes the landing of troops on Taiwan quite hard. Almost everyone recognizes this, including Dmitry Alperovitz. And the other aspect of this, of course, is that it's always easy to defend an island. It's always hard to invade an island. The British have made this clear in their history, Spanish Armada and so forth. So in that very real sense, the costs to trying to win and win quickly are high. The risks are high as well of losing. And how many could be justified in this attack? 300,000 deaths, 500,000. Russia, of course, has not completed its attack on Ukraine and has lost or had casualties of over 700,000, which is huge. And that's for a land invasion. That was a very easy way to just sort of cross a border. This is much more difficult. So that's number one. The number 2 aspect of this is what we would call in international relations, and I'm a professor University of Virginia in international relations. We would call this the risks of getting on the slippery slope to war with the United States. Now, we know about the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's different. But the Chinese are very much aware that the U.S. has this presence in East Asia. It's not just in the Philippines and building armed or at least Air Force bases in northern Philippines. It has Guam. It has Okinawa. It has alliance connections with both South Korea and Japan. There's a very high likelihood, or at least there's some likelihood, that even under Trump, who was reluctant to get involved, the U.S. might be drawn into war if Taiwan were to be invaded. Now, the Chinese are aware of that. They were certainly aware of it under Biden, who said, if you, Mr. Xi Jinping, invade out of the blue, we will defend Taiwan. That was made quite clear a number of times, much to the chagrin of some of the State Department people, but it was made quite clear. And almost everybody knows that that was the Biden policy. What is the Trump policy? We can talk about that. It's emerging, let's just say. Some would want that commitment to be very strong, which would mean linking the Taiwanese question to the larger strategic nuclear question and causing what you might call a chicken game of sorts, where if, as in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it wasn't clear who would swerve first, there could be actual war. Local probably at the start, maybe a couple of ships were sunk in the South China Sea, inadvertently maybe, but it could escalate as we feared in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And China does not want that. If they're going to do it, they want a clean, easy victory, and they want it to be, at low risk of escalation to war with the United States. So that's what I would call the second deterrence pillar, the pillar being the high costs and risks of doing such a thing that makes any actor, rational actor, think twice. But the third pillar is the one that I'm most interested in right now because of my book, A World Safe for Commerce, which is all about American foreign policy since 1750 and how you can look at U.S. policies from a commercial angle. But this ties to a second book of mine called Economic Interdependence and War, where I look at European and Japanese ways of thinking about commerce. And almost always, when commerce is high and smart actors feel they have a positive expectation about future commerce and flows of commerce and access to raw materials and investments and markets overseas, they usually are quite pacific. They're quite moderate in their behavior. Why? Because they believe they are growing through that trade. They believe they're getting advantages through those connections with other great powers. And they want that to continue. Now, this is where expectations of future trade come in as a deterrent, because China for 45 years or 40 years has had relatively moderate or positive expectations of future trade. Come on. I mean, they have gone from almost zero trade in the Mao years to having more than 50% of their GDP tied up in exports and imports. Now it's around 38, 39%, but that historically is very, very high for a great power to have almost 40% of your GDP tied up in trade. Now, again, trade is exports and imports. What that means, therefore, is that they're worried that if they were to invade in Taiwan and the U.S. and the allies in East Asia or Europe were to put on the kinds of sanctions we'd put on Russia, that would cause a dramatic change from a growth rate of right now about 4% a year to a decline in the Chinese economy. And what that level of decline would be is up in the air. But imagine it from Xi Jinping's perspective. If he says to himself, okay, the direct costs I can handle, the risks of a nuclear war with Russia, with the U.S. are relatively low, or maybe Trump won't get in. But if there's pressure to sanction China and cut it off from raw materials, especially, that's the analogy we can talk about with Japan 1941, or simply that the markets dry up and we can't sell our EVs, our electric vehicles overseas. We can't sell our goods, even our cheaper products overseas anymore. That would cause a devastating effect on China's long-term prospects. Now, I'm going to just say this, that Bloomberg News, well-respected business newspaper, if you will, online, said that if sanctions were even relatively moderate or closer, say, to what we did against Russia, China's GDP could decline by 17% in 1 year. Now, that's not a bad estimate. I'd been saying 20% for years and years on public settings. So I was kind of relieved to hear Bloomberg say, yeah, our analysis says 17%. Now, net from 4% to 17%, that's a 21% drop. And that's huge for a Xi Jinping. It's not just geopolitical, and I'll stop talking here, but it's not just geopolitical decline. It's the domestic implications of that for a Xi Jinping that is always worried, as the Chinese Communist Party has been since 1989, of another Tiananmen Square, June 1989, where the regime itself could be dealing with revolts and uprisings across many cities. This is an obsession with the Chinese government. Xi Jinping spent the first 3 months in power in 2012, 2013, putting together a 3-hour video on how to avoid another Tiananmen Square, how to avoid what Gorbachev's policy led to in Eastern Europe, that is, revolts internally. And it was tied to economics. It was tied, as it was in 89, and it was tied, of course, to domestic survival of an ideology that they think is valuable. Good for them. But what they think about is, how do we keep our economic legitimacy? We keep it growing, or a political legitimacy growing through an economic growth rate, just like in the US. And if it declines by even 5%, that itself is a huge, huge problem for them domestically, not to mention geopolitically. So when you put those three things together, we actually have a pretty good, I would call it a grand strategy posture, which is that we can deter Xi Jinping from thinking about invading Taiwan by the very simple logic of saying to him, look, your direct costs are high because we've been helping Taiwan build up its defense capability, especially in the last year, since April, in fact, with the new package of arms and defense policy postures that are going into protecting Taiwan. But secondly, we still have naval superiority overall, and we have it in technical terms, in terms of aircraft carriers, in the East Asian area. And this third element, very big pillar, very different from Russia, this economic cost that we can impose upon them if they were to attack Taiwan. So when you add up all those things, and we can debate whether more stronger not pro-war, but those who fear war in the next 3 years, like Dmitry Alperovitz and Birch Colby and others, are correct, or whether these other pillars and these other elements of deterrence will indeed make Xi Jinping think twice. Now, he's getting old. That's another last dimension. He's getting old enough to say, oh, well, I got to do this before I'm out of power or die, my place in history. But it's different. It's different than Ukraine. And in fact, the costs of Ukraine have been a wake-up call, I think, for the Chinese leadership.